Hi, Nick Veach again. This is the second part of that video I'm doing on Randall Carlson, in which I'm exploring the effects of what are called Carolina Bay chondrite meteors and the impact which they may have had in recent paleontological history, which is to say at the end of the Pleistocene and during the preceding several tens of thousands of years, and the threat which they still portend for us even today, I believe. Okay, let's get into this again. Okay, so yesterday we dealt with the physical reality of Carolina Bays. This was the LiDAR graphic that I was looking at yesterday, and but here's another one I found as well. It's not LiDAR, but look at that. Look at all of those Carolina Bays, all those impacts. That's just insane. So what I want to talk about today is the possibility that these the same kind of impacts that are creating these Carolina Bays are also responsible for the massive destruction of wildlife. In particular, the evidence for this, I think, has to do with the way in which the animals were often found. Let's tune in here to Randall Carlson, who starts explaining some of it right here.
This frozen woolly mammoth collapsed around the year 1900. Again, it was one of these warm springs coming out of the Little Ice Age. And the bank of the river collapsed and exposed the skull and forelimb of this big 6-ton mammoth. And it was excavated. His remains are now mounted in, I believe, in a museum in Moscow, I think, if I remember right, a Russian museum. This shows the condition in which the mammoth was found. And you can see here is his back leg, and here's his left forelimb. You can see the position in which the mammoth was found. Now, there are many clues here that need to be addressed. For one
of the funny things which this indicates is just the way, the posture in which the animals died. They're not tipped over, they're not fleeing something, they're just crushed, they're just like slammed straight into the ground by something.
One thing, bones were broken. And something else that I haven't mentioned before, I don't think, in discussion of this mammoth, is that he was found with an erect penis. What does that mean? It means he was suffocated and under great pressure, and the blood was forced to the extremities. When anybody, any male dies under extreme suffocation or pressurization, they will be found with an erection. This guy was found with an erection, so he was clearly suffocated under great pressure.
So again, that's one of the themes I want to deal with today is what would cause this massive pressure, something which could weigh on an animal of that size, that bulk, and just crush it into the ground, smash its pelvis, and cause it to have an erection and all the rest of it. But it's not just the case that animals are found compressed; they're also found just kind of obliterated, just smashed into smithereens. So here, for example, we found a description. This is from a book which Randall recommended. It's called The Mammoth and the Flood, written in 1887. The author writes, "Then we often find in these places a single skull of a mammoth, that is, one or two dismembered bones, a tooth or two, or a tusk, without evidence of other parts. Had the animal voluntarily walked into these places and died there, we should have had some other evidence than these fragmentary parts of the skeleton." What he's doing is he's countering the argument that these animals somehow died naturally, that they wandered into a swamp and they drowned, or they were mired in it and they couldn't escape and they starved to death or something of that nature. And so to counter that argument, he says, had the animal voluntarily walked into these places and died there, we would have had some other evidence than these fragmentary parts of the skeleton. I have examined a small swampy depression in which 2 teeth of a mastodon were found, and which was not sufficiently broad or deep to have buried an entire animal of mastodon dimensions. And had the entire body by chance been brought there, it is not probable that there would have been only the 2 teeth remaining. In another place, I have seen a single tusk exhumed from a freshwater shell marl deposit beneath a peaty accumulation, with other indications of the skeleton, and certainly the teeth are as likely to be preserved as the tusk. It is not uncommon to find 1 tooth or more in situations where no other parts of the skeleton are found. In other words, there's a strange phenomenon whereby bits and pieces of animals are being found in various locations. I mean, how do these animals become just like I say, obliterated into a million pieces, as it were? Now, of course, the counter-argument would be that you expect to find animals, wild animals, wolves and whatever else, to be eating parts of the mammoths and all the rest. But you don't find tooth marks. You don't find the usual sort of evidence of the flesh or whatever else of these animals being eaten. Not to mention the fact you find entire whole animals which are obliterated, which are smashed, crushed, like the baby mammoth that Carlson was talking about, for example. And then there's evidence of the shockwave effect, whereby if you have a shockwave, animals just kind of get swept up, almost like a tornado. But in this case, instead of being swirled around and separated, they become just kind of collapse into each other. A shockwave picks up one animal, smashes into another animal, and they all get kind of swept together until they hit and lodge into some obstruction. And so here, for example, I would further quote as very apposite some remarks by Mr. Maxwell about the 5 skeletons of mastodons found together. He says the remains were found covered from 4 to 6 feet deep, except for the largest, which lay near the southeast side of the basin and were but slightly covered. A few feet to the north of this lay the next in size on its back, and a little to the north and west of this the other 2, both as if in a standing position, and the calf was found in a similar position near the north side of the basin. Not more than 1/4 of the basin has been examined. Blah, blah, blah. The question very naturally occurs, how and when did so many of these large animals become embedded in this narrow space? And it's not just mastodons either. If you look at the paragraph over here on the right, the unweathered bones, the intact skeletons, the crowds of animals of different species found together, the similarity and condition of the remains, all converge upon one conclusion, namely the existence of a great and sudden hecatomb. A hecatomb is basically the death of a large number of animals, basically. So here again, it's a situation where all these animals are just being slammed together. You kind of find the same thing at the KT boundary, where you find the remains of animals all just kind of slapped together, the dead dinosaurs and whatever other wildlife that was around at the time. Everything's just kind of there have been finds whereby all the way where Triceratops, Hadrosaurs, this kind of a thing, all just kind of end up being swept up, being kind of, because of the blast wave, they're all killed, and then they kind of get wind up, lodging on something in the landscape, which is where they end up being found 65 million years later by paleontologists. And in addition to that, we also have another situation another scenario in which dead animals are being found. So to review, we've got dead animals that are found basically standing up and who appear to be crushed. You have animals which have been somehow swept up together and piled onto each other and found dead. Then you have other scenarios where you have species of every description all appearing all just swept up again, as if there was a blast wave or a tsunami or something of this nature, where just kind of swept all these dead bodies together. And the other scenario is animals being buried deeply. So here, for example, this last paragraph here. If we are to meet the facts, we need a cause which not only destroyed animals old and young, great and small, aggressive and helpless in a common doom, and in many cases in herds or schools of mammoths and mastodons, but also buried them deeply in such tough material as gravel and clay while still intact, and buried them occasionally very deeply. And he gives an example. Thus, in cutting the Great Western of Canada Railway, elephants' remains were found buried 60 feet deep near Lake Ontario, and buried with them were shells, both land and fresh water, and under deposits which form like the bluff beds, in other words, continuous strata unbroken and undisturbed over many miles of country. And it seems to me, he says, there is no other agency available to produce this result save a flood of water. And to go back to the first scenario, he includes, as with the mammoth in Siberia and in Europe, so in North America, the carcasses of the mastodon are often found in an erect position. They're standing up. Right? Thus, Cuvier states that the mastodons found in the river of the Great Osages were nearly all in a vertical position. And finally, let's go back to the scenario whereby animals are just obliterated. The paragraph here in the corner here. The famous Cohoes mastodon was found disintegrated in a very curious way. The lower jaw and a single foot bone were found resting upon a projection of rock between 2 depressions or concave walls of small potholes in the margin of what afterwards proved to be a larger pothole. In the bottom of the same pothole, lying on a bed of clay, broken slate, gravel, and water-worn pebbles, and covered with moss, ooze, and vegetable soil, lay the principal parts of the skeleton, mostly in juxtaposition. Other bones occurred 30 or 40 feet distant in 3 several places, on a somewhat lower level than the great mass of the skeleton. So in other words, the animal is just, the bits and pieces are all over the place, as if it was exploded. Portions of a right foreleg and foot, clearly of the same animal, were found in another pothole 60 feet distant, while the skull, with the cervical vertebrae from the 2nd to the 7th inclusive, were essentially in their natural relations, in their natural position. The atlas was missing and not found at all. The lateral processes of the second and the third, and the spines of the fifth and the sixth vertebrae were broken off. Of the dorsal vertebrae, the first four, the eighth, the 12th, and the last five remained, while the other 9 were absent. Similar conditions existed in respect to other bones. In the right foreleg, the head of the humerus alone remained in that connection, while the radius and the ulna and some foot bones had been removed to the distance of more than 60 feet to the southwest, and at least 20 feet above the principal parts of the skeleton. Okay, so what would cause, what could account for all of this? Everything from the flood, for the animals that were buried near Lake Ontario, which were discovered by the railroad company. What could blast huge animals like this to smithereens? What could sweep them up like a tornado with that kind of power, and then just kind of all fetch them against a bluff or the edge of a cliff, or not a cliff, but any sort of protuberance of the landscape, basically. What single phenomenon could we find that could account for all of this? Okay, as I mentioned yesterday, we have 500,000 of these Carolina bays up and down the East Coast. And if we extrapolate the same number, if we presume, and maybe this is wrong, maybe this is right, I don't know, but if we presume that you would have similar number of impacts across the rest of the continental United States of America, then we're talking something like 5 million of these things in the last 100,000 years or so, which is again about 50 per day, but again, not day, per year. But I doubt very much they came down in a cycle like that. It's much more likely that they showed up in a bunch. This is a Shoemaker levy. This is the comet which blasted into Jupiter. I think it's separated into about 21 comets, basically. There's one original comet and then gravity. A lot of times comets are composed not of a stone or just one block of ice or something like that, but a lot of times it's a lot of gravel, ice, sand, all manner of things together. And so they're very easily separated by gravitational forces. In this case, again, 21 pieces. Coming into our atmosphere, it probably looks something like this if it came in at night. So instead of one of these, imagine 50 or 100 or even 1,000 coming in at once. Again, not 1, not 2, not 5, not 10, 50 or 100 or 1,000 coming in at the same time.
О, нихуя метеорит, блядь.
And then instead of one of these coming down, imagine like maybe 20, 30, 40 at a time. So magnify the sound by let's say for every 50 that landed, maybe 500 exploded way high up in the atmosphere. So you could have 100 like this, or 1,000 even for like this, for every 50 or 100 which actually made it down towards the land, let's say within let's say a mile above land. It's just crazy to think about it.
Охренеть. Где-то упал. Слышишь? Это знаешь?
Anyway, you get the idea. Okay, so we've seen the kind of explosion which takes place way up high in the atmosphere at a kind of a safe distance. It still causes damage, it still smashes windows, that kind of thing, but it's not nearly close up to the ground. Let's see what it looks like when it's when it blasts off. Let's check out a blast wave at ground level first. Jesus, that's just a car bomb. Good Lord. Everybody sit in the deck. Now check it out in slow motion. Look at that. See that? That's what's doing the damage. That's what's killing the wildlife. But this is a small one. This is a tiny thing. Check that out. That's just a car bomb. Again, that's what's doing all the damage. That's what's destroying the wildlife. That's what's smashing them to pieces. That's what's obliterating them when they're close. That, from a greater distance, is what's sweeping them up and carrying them along the ground and piling them up against promontories and all the rest of it. But to really gain an appreciation for the scale of these things, because we have to keep in mind the power of these things. So each one of these impacts, if it's on the Tunguska scale, is about 30 megatons, up to 30 megatons. This is probably about a 10 megaton explosion, care of Ivan. This is back in 1950s, 1953, I think. Let's check it out. See the kind of blast wave we're talking about. And this is just one. Patriotic tunes. And this is the bad guys. Sit up and slam. Here she goes. And what happens next? Check this out. This is just frightening. Look at that shot. Jesus Christ. That's your mammoth. That's your forest. That's your horses, your buffalo, your giant sloths, your giant cave bears, your
Ракетные
bulls.
войска – это ядерная мощь нашей страны.
And that's all she wrote. You know, one of the interesting things about the way these meteors kill things is that they're actually highly efficient. The kind of the Homer Simpson way of killing off wildlife would be like the KT boundary impact, where you had this massive meteor or comet, whatever, which smashed into the Yucatan Peninsula, and did all of its damage that way. But actually, it's much more efficient if you explode, let's say 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet or whatever else above ground level. So, for example, with Hiroshima, that's how it was done. At 8:09 in the morning, Tibbets started his bomb run and handed control over to his bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee. The release at 8:15 Hiroshima time went as planned. And Little Boy, containing about 64 kilograms of uranium-235, took 44.4 seconds to fall from the aircraft, flying at about 31,000 feet, to a detonation height of about 1,900 feet above the city, about 580 meters. So in other words, to maximize the damage, the bomb was detonated 600 meters above the city. And it's the same thing with these chondrite meteors. The Carolina Bays impacts. These are not happening at ground level because there's no rocky material that if you look into underground, there's very little. The thing blasts basically high up in the air, and there's a concentrated blast wave which then strikes the ground, which carves out what we see as the Carolina Bays. But that's not an actual impact crater. Anyway, that's one of the reasons why, for example, he mentions here the Enola Gay, traveled 11.5 miles, almost 20 kilometers, before it felt the shock waves from the blast. So you're more than 10 miles away, and you still feel the shock wave from the blast, and that was 1,000 times smaller than the impacts we're talking about. By the way, the Hiroshima blast left this sort of damage. Look familiar? Does it remind you of this, or this, or this, or this? By the way, this is a picture from where is this now? This is a book on the Hinckley fire, and the author's pointing out the sort of forest which was just burned to a crisp. This is, I think, the same kind of forest that you'd find in Tunguska. Super thick, super high, and 800 square miles of this was just leveled in a heartbeat. Kaboom. So that's what you're looking at. Same kind of trees here as you see here. And here, by the way, is what Hinckley looked like after the fire. Look familiar? Hiroshima again. Hinckley, which Randall Carson believes was caused by, I wouldn't say chondrite meteors necessarily, but this similar phenomenon whereby methane gas came down from meteors and caught on fire. Again, that's another shot. I'm including this because it's all related, actually. Maybe I'll get into it in another video. Anyway, to recapitulate, what I'm getting at basically is I think a serious candidate for the elimination of so much wildlife in North America, the extinction of so many species, the disappearance of Clovis culture, which is the human beings who are living here as well. Everything was wiped out, it seems, is these Carolina bays. Again, just imagine, not one of these, but imagine 100 or 1,000 of these things coming down, or even more at one time. Not one, imagine 1,000. Oh, Jesus. Goodbye, wildness. Goodbye, forest. Goodbye, everything. And that's why Elon Musk's Elon Musk wants us to get the hell off the planet. Can you blame him? If we get another comet hurtling through the solar system, a major one, a big one, so let's say something which is, let's say, 50 kilometers in diameter, something like that, it comes hurtling by, the debris stream that thing's going to leave behind is just going to be insane. Apparently it's happened before, and it's going to happen again sooner or later, so we need to get off the planet. Anyway, I hope it says something useful. I hope this is informative, and anyway, I'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.